There's a point where philosophy stops being a system and becomes a battlefield. Not a battlefield of personalities, but one of views. Because once you begin to think seriously about knowing, about reality, about objectivity, you discover something unsettling. That is that people don't just disagree, they disagree in structured ways. And those disagreements are not random, they actually follow patterns. Lonergan calls those patterns positions and counterpositions. And understanding that distinction is what turns metaphysics into a dialectic. Let's begin with a simple observation. Philosophy is full of contradictions. Realism versus idealism, empiricism versus rationalism, objectivity versus relativism. And traditionally we treat these as competing theories. Pick one, defend it, refute the others. But Lonergan takes a different approach. He asks, why do these opposing views exist at all? And his answer is actually striking. Every philosophy arises from the dynamic structure of cognitive activity, either correctly understood or distorted by oversight or by bias. That is a key. Philosophies are not arbitrary. They are governed in how we understand knowing. But that understanding can go right or wrong. So, what is a position? A position is a view that is consistent with the structure of knowing we have established. It affirms that knowing involves experience, understanding, and judgment. That the real is what is intelligently grasped and reasonably affirmed. That objectivity is the achievement of authentic subjectivity. And a counterposition? Well, a counterposition is a view that contradicts that structure. It might say the real is what is already out there now. Knowing is just looking. Truth is whatever appears obvious. Now, here's the crucial point. A counterposition is not simply false. It is self-contradictory because it uses the operations of knowing to deny those same operations. So, for example, if someone says, knowing is just seeing, they are not just seeing that. They are making a judgment and they are affirming something is true. And so they are already relying on the structure they deny. This is what gives dialectic its power. That is, you don't just argue against a counterposition, you show that it collapses from within. Now, Lonergan actually goes further and he adds something even deeper. This is not just about isolated arguments, it's about the polymorphism of consciousness. Human consciousness does not operate in one mode, it operates in many. It operates in the biological, the practical, the aesthetic, the dramatic, the intellectual. And these modes can conflict. So, a counterposition is not simply a mistake. It is often the result of a shift in a pattern, from intellectual to practical, from judgment to immediacy, from inquiry to habit. This is why counterpositions feel convincing. They are grounded in real experience, not just the right level of experience. Now, this leads to a general theorem. Any philosophy, whether actual or possible, rests on cognitional activity, either correctly understood or distorted by omission or bias. That is a radical claim. It's a radical claim because it means that philosophy is not just about ideas, that it's about how we are operating as knowers. But Lonergan immediately acknowledges a difficulty. You cannot simply deduce every philosophy from first principles. You cannot say, this philosopher believed X because of assumption Y. Because real philosophers are not just systems, they are historical. They respond to problems of their time, and they are shaped by culture. So, the issue must likewise shift. It must shift from abstract deduction to historical process. And this is where dialectic expands. That is, metaphysics is not just a system. It is also a method of interpretation, a way of understanding how different viewpoints arise, how they develop, how they conflict, and how they can be evaluated. This is precisely why Lonergan introduces the idea of a universal viewpoint. Not a single theory, but a framework, a structure that can encompass all possible viewpoints. But what grounds that? What grounds that universal viewpoint? The structure of knowing itself. And it's the structure of knowing itself because every viewpoint, no matter how strange, is still an attempt to understand and affirm. So if you understand the structure of knowing, you can understand the structure of any viewpoint. Now, we can actually take a step back. We can take a step back and look at something even deeper than that. The relation between metaphysics, between myth, and between mystery. Lonergan introduces a paradox. We know what we do not know. He calls this the known unknown. We ask questions, but we do not yet have answers. So we have an orientation towards something that we cannot yet define. What does that do? Well, that creates tension. A pull beyond what is familiar, beyond what is already understood. And that tension actually appears in two ways: myth and mystery. What is myth? Well, myth is what happens when the desire to know is misdirected. When we try to understand, but without distinguishing experience, insight, and judgment. When we confuse imagination with reality, and when we treat symbols as literal. Mystery is different. Mystery is not error. What it actually is the recognition that there is always more to know. So myth and metaphysics are opposed, but they are also related. Because myth is an early, untutored expression of the desire to know. And metaphysics is that same desire becoming conscious of itself. So, dialectic is not just about refuting errors. It's about understanding their origin and transforming them. Now, what this does is it leads to one of the most important distinctions in this chapter. That is, the distinction between description and explanation. Description, first off, relates things to us, how they appear, how they feel, how they function in our experience. Explanation, on the other hand, relates things to one another. It relates these things in terms of intelligible relations, that is, systems, structures. And this is where many counterpositions actually arise. When we try to do explanation, but we actually remain trapped in description. We attribute explanatory power to images, to sensations, and to feelings. And this leads to obvious errors. Anthropomorphism, that is, projecting our experience onto the external world, onto nature. Or it could lead to subjectivism, projecting our own mindset onto others. But Lonergan is actually clear. If you want explanation, you must detach from description. What does that mean? Well, it means not to abandon experience, but to go beyond it. Now, this becomes obviously crucial in interpretation, because Interpretation is not just reading words. It's understanding meaning. And meaning does not lie out there. It arises in the interpreter, in their experience, in their insights, in their judgments. So, interpretation requires method. It does not require guesswork. That's important. And this is where dialectic becomes concrete. It becomes concrete when Lonergan proposes what he calls a set of canons, rules, essentially. Rules for a methodical hermeneutic. So first is the canon of relevance. That is, interpretation must begin from the universal viewpoint, and it must express meaning in terms of being. Second, the canon of explanation. Interpretation must be explanatory, not descriptive. Third, the canon of successive approximations. Interpretation is cumulative. It improves over time. Fourth, the canon of parsimony. That is, do not invent what cannot be verified. Fifth, the canon of residues. Acknowledge what cannot be fully explained. What are these canons? Well, these rules, they're not arbitrary. They're not arbitrary rules. They actually arise, as you should be familiar by now, from the structure of knowing. So, now everything that we've said can be brought together. Metaphysics is dialectical. It's dialectical because human consciousness is polymorphic, because knowing can go right or it can go wrong, because viewpoints can be positions or they can be counterpositions. So, the task of metaphysics is not just to build a system, but to identify positions, to expose counterpositions, to reverse those counterpositions, to integrate the results. What does it mean? It means that this is practical. It's not abstract as it may seem. Every time you encounter a claim, you can ask, does this align with the structure of knowing, or does it contradict the structure of knowing? Every time you feel something is obvious, you can ask, is this a judgment, the third level, or is it just immediacy, the already out there now? Every time you interpret someone else, you can ask, am I explaining their meaning, or am I projecting my own onto them? What is this? This way of questioning. This is dialectic in practice. So, let's summarize the thesis of episode 17 and the corresponding chapter and insight. Metaphysics becomes dialectical when it distinguishes positions from counterpositions, when it traces their origins in the polymorphic structure of consciousness and uses that insight to transform error into development. And this changes everything, because now disagreement is not a dead end, but it's actually the opposite. It's a starting point. In the next episode, we move even further. We move from dialectic to the full structure of truth. So, if this helped, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because now the system is not just built, it's alive.